The locket weighed heavy in Penelope Hartford's palm as the storm clouds gathered overhead, black as coal and just as cold. It was the last piece of her old life, the only treasure she had left to trade. But when a person was desperate enough, even the dearest of keepsakes could become currency. Arizona Territory, 1878. Penelope had been traveling for 18 days, each one harder than the last. Her once fine traveling dress was now tattered at the hem, her boots worn through at the soles. The stagecoach accident that had claimed the lives of her fellow passengers had left her with nothing but the clothes on her back, her mother's locket, and a desperate need to reach Silver Creek, a town that seemed to retreat from her grasp with each weary step. The first fat raindrop hit her cheek as she crested the hill. In the valley below stood a small cabin, smoke curling from its chimney. Light glowed in the single window, golden and inviting against the darkening sky. Penelope clutched her locket tighter and began her descent, each step sending jolts of pain through her blistered feet. The rain came faster now, soaking through her thin shawl as she approached the cabin door. She stood there for a moment, pride warring with necessity. Her father had always said pride would be her downfall, but he'd never imagined his daughter would be reduced to begging for shelter. Penelope raised her hand and knocked 3 times, the sound barely audible over the increasing roar of the rain. She waited, shivering, praying that whoever owned this isolated cabin would have enough kindness to let her in, even just for the night. The door swung open, and warm light spilled out around the silhouette of a tall man. His face was shadowed beneath the brim of a weather-beaten hat, but she could make out the strong line of his jaw, dark with several days' worth of stubble. "Can I help you, madam?" His voice was deep, rough-edged like he didn't use it often. Penelope swallowed hard. "I apologize for the intrusion, sir. I was caught in the storm and—" She faltered, embarrassment flooding her cheeks with heat despite the cold rain. "I have nothing to offer except this." She held out the locket, the gold catching the light from inside the cabin. "It was my mother's. I would trade it for shelter until the storm passes." The man stepped forward, and she could see him clearly now. He was younger than she'd first thought, perhaps 30, with eyes the color of the Arizona sky at noon. His expression was unreadable as he looked from the locket to her face. "Keep your locket, miss," he said finally. "You look half-drowned and fully exhausted. Come inside before you catch your death." Relief made her knees weak, but Penelope remained standing, clutching the locket to her chest. "I cannot accept charity, sir. I must offer something in exchange." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Then how about your name? That seems fair trade for a roof." "Penelope Hartford," she said, extending her hand formally despite her bedraggled appearance. He took it, his calloused palm warm against her frozen fingers. "Preston Miles. Some folks around here call me Wolf, but that's a story for another time." He stepped aside, gesturing for her to enter. "Welcome to my home, Miss Hartford. It ain't much, but it's dry." He wasn't exaggerating. The cabin was sparse but tidy, with a small table, 2 chairs, a narrow bed in the corner, and a stone fireplace where a pot of something savory-smelling bubbled. A rifle hung above the mantel, and a few books were stacked on a rough-hewn shelf. "Thank you, Mr. Miles," Penelope said, standing awkwardly just inside the door, water pooling beneath her feet. "I truly appreciate your kindness." "Wolf will do," he replied, moving to stir the pot over the fire. "Or Preston if you prefer. I reckon formalities don't mean much out here." He glanced at her over his shoulder. "There's a blanket on the bed if you want to dry off. I'll turn my back." Penelope hesitated, then moved to the bed, wrapping the rough wool blanket around her shoulders. It smelled of wood smoke and the outdoors, but it was blessedly warm. "Are you headed somewhere in particular?" Preston asked, still facing the fire. "Not many women travel these parts alone." "Silver Creek," she answered. "I have an aunt there. She doesn't know I'm coming, but she's the only family I have left." Preston nodded, ladling stew into a wooden bowl. "Silver Creek's a good 3 days' walk from here, and that's in fair weather." He handed her the bowl and a spoon. "Eat. You look like you haven't had a proper meal in days." Penelope's stomach growled in response, and she accepted the food gratefully. The stew was simple beans, dried beef, and what might have been wild onions, but at that moment, it tasted better than any fine dinner she'd ever had in Boston. "The stagecoach I was on was attacked 4 days ago," she explained between cautious spoonfuls. "Bandits. They took everything of value and ran off the horses. The driver and another passenger were killed." She swallowed hard, the memory still raw. "I've been walking ever since." Preston's expression darkened. "The Sutton gang, most likely. They've been causing trouble all through this territory." He sat in one of the chairs, giving her space. "I'm sorry about your companions." "I didn't know them well," Penelope admitted. "I only arrived in Arizona a week ago." She looked down at her bowl, suddenly aware of how far from home she truly was. "Everything is so different here." "What brings you all the way from Boston, is it?" Preston asked, his keen eyes noting her accent. "My father died," she said simply. "The bank took our house and everything in it. My Aunt Jane is my only living relative." Preston nodded, asking no further questions, which Penelope appreciated. They sat in companionable silence as the rain pounded on the roof and thunder rolled across the valley. "You can have the bed tonight," Preston said when she'd finished eating. "I'll take the floor by the fire." "I couldn't possibly. You can and you will," he interrupted firmly but not unkindly. "No offense, madam, but you look like you've been through hell. A proper night's rest will do you good." Penelope wanted to argue but was too exhausted to muster the strength. "Thank you," she said instead. "Just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll continue to Silver Creek." "We'll see what the weather has to say about that," Preston replied, glancing toward the window where rain lashed against the glass. "This storm's been brewing for days, might not pass so quick." He was right. By morning, the rain had turned to a deluge. The path down the valley transformed into a rushing stream of mud. Penelope stood at the window, clutching her still damp shawl around her shoulders, dismay tightening her throat as she watched the water rise. "Told you," Preston said, coming to stand beside her. He'd slept in his clothes, his hair mussed from a night on the hard floor, but he didn't seem to mind. "That creek at the bottom of the hill will be impassable by noon." "I cannot impose on you another night," Penelope protested, though the thought of venturing out into the storm made her stomach clench with dread. Preston shrugged. "It's no imposition. I don't get much company out here, and I reckon you're safer waiting out the storm than trying to ford a flooded creek." He moved to the fireplace, stoking the embers. "Besides, I could use some help around the place if you're of a mind to earn your keep." Penelope straightened, relief flooding through her. "Of course, I'm not afraid of work, Mr. Miles." A small smile touched his lips. "I never thought you were, Miss Hartford." Over the next 2 days, as the storm continued its assault on the Arizona landscape, Penelope found ways to repay Preston's hospitality. She mended his shirts, which were worn thin at the elbows and missing most of their buttons. She organized his meager pantry, stretching the supplies with skills learned during the lean months after her father's death. She even showed him how to make biscuits with the last of his flour, the two of them working side by side in the small cabin while rain drummed a constant rhythm overhead. By the third morning, when the clouds finally began to break, Penelope was surprised to find herself reluctant to leave. Preston Miles was unlike any man she'd ever known in Boston. Quiet but not cold, strong but never intimidating. He spoke little of his past, though she gathered he'd been on his own since he was young, working as a ranch hand before saving enough to stake his own small claim. "The water's receding," Preston observed as they stood outside the cabin, surveying the valley below. The air was fresh and clean after the rain, the desert transformed by patches of green that hadn't been there before. "Yes," Penelope agreed, tucking a strand of hair behind her ear. She'd managed to wash it the day before, using rainwater Preston had collected in barrels. "I should be able to continue to Silver Creek today." Preston nodded, his expression unreadable. "It's still a long walk. I could ride with you partway, make sure you don't run into trouble." Penelope felt a flutter in her chest at his offer. "You've already done so much, I couldn't ask for more." "You didn't ask, I offered." His eyes met hers and something passed between them, something Penelope wasn't ready to name. "Let me saddle up Samson. We can be in Silver Creek by nightfall if we ride double." Before she could respond, a distant sound caught their attention: hoofbeats, approaching fast. Preston's posture changed instantly, his hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "Get inside," he said, his voice low and urgent. "Now." Penelope hesitated only a moment before obeying, her heart pounding as she retreated into the cabin. Through the window, she watched as 3 riders crested the hill, dust rising behind them as they approached Preston's homestead. Preston stood his ground, one hand resting casually on his gun belt as the riders drew up in front of him. Even from inside, Penelope could feel the tension radiating from the scene. The lead rider, a man with a shock of red hair visible beneath his hat, leaned forward in his saddle. "Miles," he called out, his voice carrying through the thin walls of the cabin. "Heard you might be harboring a fugitive." "Don't know what you're talking about, Sutton," Preston replied evenly. "I live alone." Penelope's blood ran cold. Sutton, the name Preston had mentioned in connection with the stagecoach attack. These were the bandits who had left her stranded, who had killed the driver and passenger without a moment's hesitation. "That's so." Sutton dismounted, his spurs jingling as he took a step toward Preston. "Because word is a woman survived our little encounter with the Tucson stage, a woman carrying something valuable." His eyes flicked to the cabin. "Mind if we take a look inside?" "I mind," Preston said, his stance widening slightly. "This is my property, Sutton. You and your boys best ride on." Sutton's laugh was ugly. "Or what? You'll take on all 3 of us." He shook his head. "Don't be stupid, Miles. We just want the woman and whatever she's carrying, then we'll be on our way." Penelope's hand went to the locket at her throat. It wasn't particularly valuable, just gold plated with a small pearl inset, but these men had killed for less. She looked around desperately for somewhere to hide, but the cabin offered few options. Outside, the confrontation was escalating. "Last chance, Miles," Sutton warned, his hand hovering near his pistol. "Step aside." "Can't do that," Preston replied calmly. "There's no woman here, and even if there was, she'd be under my protection." One of Sutton's companions, a wiry man with a pockmarked face, spat on the ground. "Let's just shoot him and be done with it, Hank." Sutton raised a hand, silencing his companion. "Miles saved my brother's life during that Apache raid 2 years back. I owe him a chance to be reasonable." His eyes narrowed. "But my patience is wearing thin." Penelope couldn't stand by and watch Preston die defending her. Taking a deep breath, she opened the cabin door and stepped outside. "I'm the woman you're looking for," she announced, her voice steadier than she felt. "But I have nothing of value. The other passengers carried the valuables." "Penelope, get back inside," Preston said without taking his eyes off Sutton. Sutton's face split into a grin. Well, well, looks like you were lying after all, Miles." He took a step toward Penelope. "Empty your pockets, sweetheart, and that locket around your neck hand it over." Penelope's fingers curled protectively around the locket. "It's only gold-plated. It's worth nothing to you." "I'll be the judge of that," Sutton replied, extending his hand. "She said it's worthless," Preston cut in, moving to stand between Penelope and Sutton, "and she's under my protection now. So unless you want to find out which of us is faster, I suggest you and your boys leave." The tension stretched tight as a bowstring. Penelope held her breath, certain that at any moment guns would be drawn and blood would be spilled. But then, unexpectedly, Sutton laughed. "You've got sand, Miles, I'll give you that." He stepped back, his posture relaxing slightly. "Tell you what, I respect a man who stands his ground. Keep the woman and her trinket." His smile turned cold. "But remember this favor when I come calling again." With that, he mounted his horse, signaling to his companions. "Let's ride, boys. Plenty of easier pickings elsewhere." They watched in tense silence as the 3 riders disappeared over the hill. Only when they were completely out of sight did Preston turn to Penelope, his expression a mixture of relief and anger. "That was foolish," he said, his voice tight. "Sutton's not a man to cross." "I couldn't let you face them alone because of me," Penelope replied, her heart still racing. "Those men killed 2 people over a strongbox of mail and a few dollars." Preston's gaze softened slightly. "All the more reason for you to have stayed hidden," he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Sutton won't forget this. It's not safe for you to stay here now, and it's certainly not safe for you to travel alone." "What choice do I have?" Penelope asked, clutching her locket. "I must get to Silver Creek." Preston was quiet for a moment, considering. "I'll take you," he finally said. "We'll leave at first light tomorrow. Pack enough supplies to make it in one day if we push hard. But your home, it'll still be here when I get back," he interrupted. "Unless Sutton decides to burn it down out of spite, which is a possibility." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Not much to burn anyway." Penelope wanted to protest further, to tell him he'd done enough, but the truth was that she needed his help. And more than that, she wanted it. "Thank you," she said simply. Preston nodded once, then moved toward the small stable attached to the cabin. "I need to check on Samson, make sure he's ready for a long ride tomorrow." Penelope watched him go, her feelings a complicated tangle. In just a few days, this stranger had become important to her in ways she couldn't fully articulate. He had given her shelter, protection, and kindness, asking nothing in return except perhaps her company. And tomorrow he would take her to Silver Creek, to her aunt's house, and their paths would diverge. The thought left an unexpected hollow feeling in her chest. That night, as they shared a simple meal of beans and the last of the biscuits, Penelope found herself studying Preston's face in the firelight. There was a quietness to him that spoke of solitude, but not loneliness, as if he had made peace with his own company. Yet there was something else there too, something that hinted at deeper waters than he allowed others to see. "May I ask you something?" she ventured when the silence had stretched comfortably between them. Preston looked up from his plate. "You can ask. Can't promise I'll answer." "Why did you let me stay?" Penelope asked. "You could have turned me away that first night. Many would have." He considered this for a moment, his eyes reflecting the dancing flames. "My mother used to say that a person's character is revealed in how they treat those who can offer them nothing." He set his empty plate aside. "Besides, I know what it's like to be alone with nowhere to go." "Is that why you live out here by yourself?" Penelope pressed gently. "Because you were alone," a shadow crossed Preston's face. "I live out here because people are complicated, land isn't." "You work it honest, it gives back honest." "Not all people are complicated in bad ways," Penelope said softly. Preston's eyes met hers across the table. "No," he agreed. "Not all." The moment stretched between them, filled with unspoken possibilities. Then Preston cleared his throat and stood, breaking the spell. "We should turn in early. Dawn comes quick and we've got a long ride ahead." Penelope nodded, gathering their plates to wash in the basin. As she worked, she found herself memorizing the details of the cabin, the way the firelight cast long shadows on the walls, the creak of the floorboards beneath Preston's boots, the smell of pine and leather that permeated everything. Tomorrow she would leave this place behind, but she wanted to remember it. Remember him. They set out at first light, Penelope seated behind Preston on Samson, a sturdy buckskin gelding with more endurance than speed. She had never ridden double before and was acutely aware of the necessity of holding onto Preston's waist as they navigated the uneven terrain. "Silver Creek's about 20 miles southeast," Preston explained as they left the valley behind. "We'll follow the old mining road most of the way. Should be there by sundown if we don't run into trouble." Penelope nodded, though he couldn't see her. "How will you get back before dark?" "I won't," he replied matter-of-factly. "I'll find a room at the boarding house and head back tomorrow." The thought of him spending money on a room because of her made Penelope uncomfortable. "My aunt would surely offer you a place to stay for the night. It's the least we could do after all your help." Preston was quiet for a moment. "We'll see." The day stretched before them. The Arizona landscape unfolding in breathtaking vistas of red rock, scrubby pine, and occasional patches of wildflowers that had sprung up after the rain. Preston pointed out landmarks as they rode an abandoned mine shaft, a rock formation that looked like a sleeping bear, a stand of cottonwoods that marked an underground spring. They stopped at midday to rest Samson and eat the jerky and hardtack Preston had packed. Sitting in the shade of a large boulder, Penelope found herself stealing glances at her companion. In the harsh daylight, she could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, evidence of years squinting against the Arizona sun. His hands, as he broke the hardtack into manageable pieces, were strong and capable, marked with small scars and calluses. "Tell me about Silver Creek," Preston said, breaking into her thoughts. "Your aunt, what's she like?" Penelope hesitated. "To be honest, I barely know her." "She's my father's sister, but they had a falling out years ago. I've only met her once when I was very young." She twisted the locket between her fingers, a nervous habit. "I'm not even certain she'll welcome me," Preston frowned. "You've come all this way without knowing if she'll take you in." "I had nowhere else to go," Penelope admitted, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "Father left nothing but debts. The bank was not sympathetic to my situation." Understanding dawned in Preston's eyes. "So you spent what little you had on a stagecoach ticket west, hoping your aunt would be more charitable than the bank." "It sounds foolish when you put it that way," Penelope said with a small, sad smile. "But yes, that was my plan." Preston shook his head. "Not foolish, brave." He looked out across the desert. "Takes courage to leave everything behind and start over, or desperation," Penelope countered. "Sometimes they're the same thing." Preston got to his feet, offering her a hand up. "We should keep moving, still got a ways to go." As the day wore on, the terrain became more challenging. The recent rains had washed out parts of the mining road, forcing them to find alternative routes through the rocky landscape. Samson was sure-footed, but even he struggled in places, forcing Preston and Penelope to dismount and lead him through the worst sections. By late afternoon, dark clouds were gathering on the horizon, and the air had taken on the electric quality that preceded a storm. "We need to pick up the pace," Preston said, eyeing the sky with concern. "That storm's moving fast." They mounted again, Samson trotting briskly down the road. Penelope held tight to Preston's waist, the rhythm of the horse's gait bringing them into closer contact than before. She could feel the solid strength of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing. It was strangely intimate, this shared journey, more intimate than anything she had experienced in her sheltered Boston life. The first rumble of thunder reached them just as the town of Silver Creek came into view in the valley below. It was larger than Penelope had expected a proper town, with a main street, a church spire visible among the buildings, and scattered homesteads on the outskirts. "Made it just in time," Preston observed as fat raindrops began to fall. "Where does your aunt live?" Penelope pulled the carefully preserved letter from her pocket, its edges soft from repeated handling. "Pine Street," she read. "She owns the millinery shop." Preston nodded, guiding Samson down the slope toward town. By the time they reached the main street, the rain was falling steadily, driving most of the town's inhabitants indoors. Shop windows glowed with lamplight as they passed, and Penelope found herself scanning each one, wondering which belonged to the aunt she barely remembered. "There," Preston said finally, pointing to a neat storefront with hats displayed in the window. A sign above the door read "Hartford Millinery" in elegant script. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs as Preston helped her down from Samson. This was at the moment her future hinged upon. What if Aunt Jane turned her away? What if the rift between her and Penelope's father was too deep to bridge? As if sensing her anxiety, Preston squeezed her hand. "Want me to come in with you?" Penelope hesitated, then nodded gratefully. His solid presence beside her gave her courage as they approached the shop door. A small bell tinkled as they entered, announcing their arrival to the slim, gray-haired woman behind the counter. I'm sorry, but we're closing for the woman stopped mid-sentence, her eyes widening as she took in Penelope's face. Good heavens, you're Edward's girl. Penelope stepped forward, clutching her locket. Aunt Jane. Yes, it's me, Penelope. Jane Hartford set down the hat she'd been trimming and came around the counter. She was older than Penelope remembered, her once auburn hair now streaked with silver, but her eyes were the same hazel as Penelope's father's had been. What on earth are you doing in Silver Creek? Jane asked, her gaze moving from Penelope to Preston and back again. And in such a state. You're soaked through. I apologize for arriving unannounced, Penelope began, the carefully rehearsed speech deserting her. Father passed away 3 months ago, the circumstances, I had nowhere else to go, something softened in Jane's expression. Edward is gone. She sighed deeply, old grief and perhaps regret crossing her features. We may have had our differences, but he was still my brother. She reached out, taking Penelope's cold hands in her warm ones. Of course you've come to the right place, child. This is your home now if you want it. Relief washed over Penelope so strongly that her knees nearly buckled. Thank you, she whispered. I'll work hard, I promise. I can sew and I learn quickly. We'll discuss all that later, Jane interrupted gently. Right now you need dry clothes and a hot meal. Her gaze shifted to Preston, who had remained respectfully by the door. And who is your companion? This is Preston Miles, Penelope said, turning to include him. He gave me shelter when I was stranded after a stagecoach robbery, and he brought me safely to Silver Creek. I owe him a great deal. Jane assessed Preston with a shrewd eye. Mr. Miles, it seems I'm in your debt for looking after my niece. Preston touched the brim of his hat. No debt, madam, just did what anyone would do. I doubt that very much, Jane replied dryly. In my experience, anyone rarely does the right thing when it's inconvenient. She gestured to the back of the shop. Please, both of you, come through to the living quarters. This weather's not fit for man nor beast. Preston hesitated. I should see to my horse. Nonsense, Jane cut in. The livery stable is just across the street. Samuel will take good care of your mount for the night. She fixed him with a look that brooked no argument. I insist you stay for dinner at the very least. It's the proper way to thank you for bringing my niece safely to me. Penelope caught Preston's eye, silently pleading with him to accept. After a moment he nodded. That's very kind of you, Mrs. Hartford. Miss Hartford, Jane corrected with a small smile. I never found a man worth giving up my independence for. She led them through a door at the back of the shop into a cozy apartment furnished with taste and comfort. Now, Penelope, let's find you something dry to wear. Mr. Miles, there's a screen in the corner if you'd like to remove your wet coat. As Jane bustled about, preparing tea and setting out towels, Penelope found herself watching Preston. He looked out of place in the feminine surroundings of her aunt's home, his tall frame and weathered appearance a stark contrast to the delicate furnishings. Yet there was something right about seeing him here, something that made her heart beat a little faster. Jane loaned Penelope a simple dress that was slightly too large but blessedly dry. By the time she emerged from behind the bedroom screen, Jane had set out a simple but hearty meal of stew and cornbread, and Preston was seated at the table, looking only slightly uncomfortable. Mr. Miles was just telling me how you appeared at his cabin in the midst of that terrible storm, Jane said as Penelope joined them. Offering your mother's locket for shelter, the very idea. Penelope felt heat rise to her cheeks. I had nothing else to offer. And I wouldn't have taken it anyway, Preston added quietly. Some things aren't meant to be traded. Jane's sharp eyes moved between them, assessing something Penelope couldn't name. Indeed, she murmured. Well, you're both safe now, and that's what matters. She served the stew with a practiced hand. Mr. Miles, Penelope tells me you have a homestead north of here. Yes, madam, small place, just me and my horse. Been there about 3 years now. And before that, Preston's expression closed slightly. Bit of everything, ranch hand mostly. Drove cattle up from Texas a few times. A restless spirit then, Jane observed. Used to be, Preston acknowledged. Less so now. The conversation flowed more easily as the meal progressed. Jane, despite her initially formidable appearance, proved to be warm and surprisingly funny, with a sharp wit that reminded Penelope of her father in his better days. She spoke of Silver Creek with obvious affection, explaining how she'd come west 15 years earlier after the death of her fiancé, determined to make a new life for herself. The town was hardly more than a mining camp back then, she recalled, but I saw potential. Women will always want hats, even in the wilderness. Perhaps especially in the wilderness, a reminder of civilization. Your shop seems to be doing well, Penelope observed, genuinely impressed by her aunt's accomplishment. Jane nodded. Well enough that I could use an assistant if you're interested. You mentioned you can sew? Yes, quite well, Penelope confirmed, hope rising in her chest. Father insisted I learn all the proper feminine accomplishments, though I was never particularly good at the pianoforte. We can survive without musical talents in a hat shop, Jane said with a smile. But a good hand with a needle is invaluable. As they talked, Penelope became increasingly aware that Preston had grown quiet, his attention seemingly focused on his meal. When she caught his eye, he offered a small smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. After dinner, as Jane cleared the plates, Preston rose from his seat. I should be going. Find that room at the boarding house before it gets any later. Don't be ridiculous, Jane said firmly. The rain is still coming down in sheets and it's pitch black out there. I have a perfectly serviceable settee in my sitting room that converts to a bed. You'll stay here tonight. Preston looked ready to refuse, but Jane continued before he could speak. I insist, Mr. Miles. I wouldn't send a dog out in this weather, let alone the man who helped my niece. Reluctantly, Preston agreed, though Penelope sensed his discomfort at imposing. When Jane excused herself to prepare the makeshift bed, Penelope found herself alone with Preston for the first time since they'd arrived in Silver Creek. Your aunt is very kind, Preston said, standing awkwardly by the window, watching the rain lash against the glass. Yes, she is. I'm fortunate. Penelope moved to stand beside him. Preston, I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done. He shook his head. No need for thanks. I'm glad you found your aunt, that she's welcoming you. Will you really leave tomorrow? The question slipped out before Penelope could consider its implications. Preston's eyes met hers, something unspoken passing between them. I should get back to my place. Make sure Sutton and his boys haven't paid it a visit. Of course, Penelope said, disappointment settling in her chest like a stone. I understand. They stood in silence for a moment, the rain providing a steady backdrop to the tension that had suddenly sprung up between them. Penelope, Preston began, his voice low. The settee is ready, Jane announced, returning to the room. If she noticed the charged atmosphere, she gave no indication. It's not the Ritz-Carlton, but it's comfortable enough for one night. Thank you, Miss Hartford, Preston said, the moment broken. You're very generous. Penelope retreated to the small bedroom Jane had prepared for her, her thoughts in turmoil. In the space of a few days, her life had transformed completely. She had found refuge with an aunt she barely knew, secured the promise of employment, and yet there was Preston Miles, who would ride away tomorrow, back to his solitary cabin in the hills. The thought left an ache in her chest that she wasn't prepared for. Sleep came fitfully that night, despite her exhaustion and the comfort of a real bed. Penelope woke early, the pre-dawn light barely filtering through the curtains. The apartment was quiet, and she moved carefully so as not to disturb her aunt or Preston as she dressed in her own clothes, now clean and mostly dry. In the sitting room, she found Preston already awake, folding the blankets Jane had provided. He looked up as she entered, and something in his expression made her heart skip. You're up early, he said softly. I wanted to see you before you left, Penelope admitted, to say goodbye properly. Preston set the blankets aside. Your aunt seems like a good woman. You'll do well here. Yes, I believe I will. Penelope took a step closer. Preston, I don't know what would have happened to me if you hadn't opened your door that night. You'd have found another door, he replied. You're stronger than you give yourself credit for, Penelope shook her head. You don't understand, it wasn't just shelter you gave me, it was. She struggled to find the words. It was kindness when I needed it most, hope when I had none. Preston's expression softened. Penelope, I have something for you, she interrupted, reaching into her pocket. She withdrew the locket, its gold chain pooling in her palm. I want you to have this. Preston's brow furrowed. I can't take that, it was your mother's. And now it's mine to give, Penelope insisted. Not as payment, but as a token of gratitude, something to remember me by. I don't need a trinket to remember you, Preston said, his voice rough with emotion. But I can't take the only valuable thing you own. Penelope stepped forward, closing the distance between them. Its value isn't in the gold or the pearl, it's in what it represents. She took his hand and pressed the locket into it, closing his fingers around it. Please. Their hands remained joined for a moment longer than necessary, and Penelope found herself looking up into Preston's eyes, seeing something there that made her breath catch. I should go, Preston said finally, but he made no move to step away. It's a long ride back. Will you come to Silver Creek again? Penelope asked, not caring how forward the question might seem. A ghost of a smile touched Preston's lips. Would you want me to? Yes, she answered without hesitation. Very much. The moment stretched between them, fragile and charged with possibility. Then slowly, Preston leaned down and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss so gentle it was barely more than a whisper. Penelope's heart soared, and she found herself responding, her hand rising to rest against his chest. When they parted, Preston's eyes were dark with emotion. I'll come back, he promised. In 2 weeks' time when I need supplies. I'll be here, Penelope replied, her voice steady despite the trembling in her limbs. The sound of movement from Jane's bedroom broke the spell. Preston stepped back, tucking the locket carefully into his shirt pocket. 2 weeks, he repeated, and then he was gone, slipping out the door into the gray dawn light. Jane found Penelope standing at the window, watching as Preston led Samson from the livery stable and mounted up. She didn't speak until Preston had ridden out of sight, disappearing down the rain-washed street. He seems like a good man, Jane observed. Quiet but solid. Penelope turned to her aunt, unsure what to say. Jane's expression was knowing but kind. It's been my experience, Jane continued, that the quiet ones are often worth listening to when they finally decide to speak. He's coming back, Penelope said, her voice barely above a whisper. In 2 weeks, Jane nodded. I thought he might. She patted Penelope's hand. Now, how about some breakfast? Then I'll show you the shop and we can discuss your duties. The next 2 weeks passed in a blur of activity. Jane proved to be not only a kind guardian but an excellent businesswoman, and Penelope threw herself into learning the millinery trade with enthusiasm. She discovered she had a natural eye for design, and Jane was generous with both praise and constructive criticism. Silver Creek itself was a revelation of vibrant community where Jane was clearly respected. She introduced Penelope to everyone from the mayor to the blacksmith's wife, and Penelope found herself welcomed with a warmth she hadn't expected. It was nothing like Boston, with its rigid social hierarchies and subtle cruelties, and she found herself blooming in the open atmosphere of the western town. But despite her busy days and new friendships, Penelope's thoughts often strayed to Preston. She found herself wondering what he was doing, whether his cabin had been safe upon his return, whether he thought of her as often as she thought of him. At night, she would touch her lips, remembering the gentle pressure of his kiss, and wonder if she had been foolish to give him her locket not because of its value, but because it seemed like too obvious a token of her growing feelings. Exactly 2 weeks after Preston had ridden away, Penelope was arranging a display of new bonnets in the shop window when the bell above the door tinkled. Her heart leapt, but it was only Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, coming in for a fitting. By closing time, Penelope's spirits had fallen. Perhaps Preston had changed his mind. Perhaps the kiss had been a moment of weakness he now regretted. Perhaps the bell rang again just as Jane was turning the sign to closed. Penelope looked up, and there he was, standing in the doorway with his hat in his hands and uncertainty in his eyes. "Mr. Miles," Jane greeted him with a smile that suggested she'd been expecting him. "How nice to see you again." "Miss Hartford," Preston nodded politely, but his eyes were on Penelope. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," Jane replied. "In fact, I was just telling Penelope that I have an engagement this evening with the Ladies' Aid Society. Perhaps you might escort her to dinner at the hotel while I'm occupied." Penelope shot her aunt a startled look, but Jane merely winked at her before disappearing into the back room to fetch her shawl. "You came back," Penelope said when they were alone, unable to keep the pleasure from her voice. "I said I would," Preston replied simply. His appearance had changed subtly. His hair was trimmed, his clothes were clean if still worn, and he'd shaved his stubble down to a neat mustache. "You look well. Silver Creek agrees with you." "It does," Penelope admitted. "Aunt Jane has been wonderful, but I've missed." She stopped herself. "It's good to see you." A small smile curved Preston's lips. "I've missed you too." Jane reappeared, effectively ending the moment. "Don't wait up for me," she told Penelope, her tone suspiciously innocent. "These aid society meetings can run quite late." With that, she swept out of the shop, leaving Penelope and Preston alone. "Your aunt is not very subtle," Preston observed, his smile widening. Penelope laughed, the tension breaking. "No, she isn't, but she means well." She hesitated. "Would you like to have dinner?" "Not necessarily at the hotel. We could eat here if you'd prefer. I've become quite a decent cook under Aunt Jane's tutelage." "I'd like that," Preston said, "if it's not too much trouble." It wasn't trouble at all. In fact, preparing a simple meal together in Jane's small kitchen felt surprisingly natural, as if they'd done it many times before. Preston moved around the space with ease, helping where he could, and they fell into a comfortable rhythm of conversation. He told her about his return journey to the cabin, which had indeed been visited by Sutton and his men. "They didn't burn it down," Preston said as he sliced bread, "but they made a mess of the place. Broke what little furniture I had, scattered my supplies." His expression darkened. "Left a note saying I owed them." "That's terrible," Penelope said, pausing in her stirring of the stew. "Will they come back?" Preston shrugged. "Maybe. Sutton holds grudges." He glanced at her. "But I've been thinking it might be time for a change anyway." "A change?" Penelope echoed, her heart quickening. "Silver Creek seems like a decent town," Preston continued, his tone deliberately casual. "Might be opportunities here I haven't considered." Penelope tried to keep her voice steady. "What sort of opportunities?" "The livery owner mentioned he's looking to sell, getting too old for the work." Preston met her eyes. "I know horses. Always thought I might like to run a stable someday when I found the right place to settle." "And you think Silver Creek might be that place?" Penelope asked, hardly daring to hope. Preston set down the knife. "Depends on what's here for me." The air between them seemed to thicken, charged with unspoken feelings. Penelope set the spoon aside and turned to face him fully. "Preston," she began, her voice soft. "When I first came to your door, I had nothing but a locket and a desperate hope. You gave me shelter when you had no reason to, asked for nothing in return, and then brought me safely to my aunt. In doing so, you gave me a future." She took a deep breath. "But in those few days, you also gave me something I wasn't looking for." "What's that?" Preston asked, his voice rough. "A reason to look back," Penelope admitted. "I've thought of you every day since you left." Preston moved closer, close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. "I've thought of you too," he said. "More than I should, maybe." "Why more than you should?" "Because you deserve better than a rough homesteader with nothing to his name but a broken-down cabin and too many years of wandering," Preston replied, honesty raw in his voice. Penelope reached up, touching his face gently. "What I deserve is a man who sees value in me beyond what I can offer him. A man who would give shelter without taking my last possession. A man who rides 20 miles in the rain to make sure I'm safe." Her fingers traced the line of his jaw. "I think I've found that man." This time when Preston kissed her, there was nothing hesitant about it. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her close as his lips claimed hers with a passion that had only been hinted at before. Penelope responded in kind, her hands sliding up to his shoulders, her body melting against his as if they were made to fit together. When they finally parted, both breathless, Preston rested his forehead against hers. "I still have your locket," he said. "Kept it safe like I promised." "Keep it a while longer," Penelope replied, "until you're sure you want to stay in Silver Creek." Preston smiled, a full, genuine smile that transformed his face. "I'm already sure about that," he said, "but I'll keep it safe anyway until the right moment to return it." The stew nearly burned while they were distracted, but neither of them particularly cared. They ate by lamplight, talking of Preston's plans for the livery stable, of Penelope's progress at the millinery, of a future that suddenly seemed full of possibilities neither had dared to imagine just weeks before. After dinner, they walked through the quiet streets of Silver Creek, Preston's hand warm around Penelope's. The town was settling down for the night, windows glowing golden in the darkness, the distant sound of piano music drifting from the saloon. "It's a good town," Preston observed as they paused at the edge of the main street. "Feels stable. Is that important to you?" Penelope asked. "Stability?" Preston considered this. "Never thought it was before. Always figured I'd keep moving, stay ahead of my past." He looked down at her, his expression serious. "But some things are worth stopping for." Penelope's heart swelled with emotion. "I'm glad you think so." They returned to the millinery as the church bell struck 9, reluctant to part but mindful of propriety. At the door, Preston took both her hands in his. "I'm going to speak with Collins about the livery tomorrow," he said. "If he's amenable to my offer, I'll ride back to my place to collect what's worth keeping, then return within the week. And if he's not?" Penelope asked, suddenly fearful that this newfound happiness might slip away. "Then I'll find another reason to stay in Silver Creek," Preston replied with certainty. "The reason that matters most is already here." His kiss goodbye was a promise, and Penelope held onto it as she watched him walk toward the boarding house where he'd taken a room for the night. Jane returned an hour later, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. "Well, did you have a pleasant evening?" "Preston is considering buying the livery stable," Penelope blurted out, unable to contain her excitement. "He might stay in Silver Creek permanently." Jane's smile was knowing. "Is that so? How fortunate for our little town to gain such an upstanding citizen." "Aunt Jane," Penelope said, suddenly serious. "Thank you for understanding, for not questioning or disapproving." Jane took Penelope's hands in hers. "My dear, I spent 15 years mourning a man I loved and lost. If I've learned anything, it's that happiness should be grasped firmly with both hands when it presents itself." She squeezed Penelope's fingers. "Besides, I rather like Mr. Miles. He has substance." Over the next few days, Penelope threw herself into her work at the millinery with renewed energy, but her thoughts were never far from Preston. On the third day, he appeared at the shop door just before closing, his expression jubilant. "Collins accepted my offer," he announced without preamble. "I'm buying the livery." Penelope's heart soared. "Preston, that's wonderful. When will you take ownership?" "Papers will be signed next week," he replied, then hesitated. "But I need to ride back to my cabin first, gather my things before Sutton decides to finish what he started." The mention of Sutton cast a shadow over Penelope's joy. "Will it be dangerous?" "I'll be careful," Preston promised. "And quick. 2 days there, a day to pack, 2 days back." He reached into his pocket and withdrew her locket. "I thought about giving this back to you now, but I'd like to hold on to it a little longer. As a talisman, if you will," Penelope nodded, understanding the sentiment. "Keep it safe and come back to me." "Wild horses couldn't keep me away," Preston replied, then grinned. "And I know horses." The 5 days of Preston's absence were the longest of Penelope's life. She tried to distract herself with work, with new friends, with Jane's company, but worry nagged at her constantly. Sutton and his gang were still out there, and Preston would be alone, vulnerable. On the evening of the fifth day, when Preston had not returned, Penelope stood at the window of Jane's apartment, scanning the darkening street for any sign of him. "He'll come," Jane assured her, patting her shoulder. "Men are rarely punctual, my dear. It's one of their many charming flaws." But as night fell with no sign of Preston, even Jane's confidence began to waver. They retired to bed eventually, though Penelope knew sleep would elude her. She was right. Hours later, she lay awake, listening to the sounds of the night, the distant howl of a coyote, the occasional shout from the saloon down the street, the creak of the building settling. When a soft knock came at the front door, Penelope was out of bed in an instant, wrapping a shawl around her nightgown as she hurried to answer it. Preston stood on the threshold, dusty and tired but blessedly whole. Relief washed over Penelope in a wave so strong she nearly staggered. "You're late," she whispered, drawing him inside. "Got delayed," Preston replied, his voice low. "Sutton's men were watching the cabin, had to wait them out, then circle around to collect my things when they finally left." He looked apologetic. "I'm sorry if I worried you." "You're here now," Penelope said, leading him to a chair. "That's what matters. Are you hungry? Thirsty?" Preston shook his head. "Just tired and glad to see you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket. "This kept me safe like you said it would." Penelope touched it gently, then closed his fingers back around it. "Keep it a while longer." In the dim light of the single lamp she'd lit, Preston's expression was solemn. "I'd rather give you something in return," he said. From his other pocket, he withdrew a small object and held it out to her. It was a ring, simple but beautiful, a band of silver with a small pearl that matched the one in her locket. "It was my mother's," Preston explained, his voice rough with emotion. "The only thing of hers I kept. I've been carrying it for years, waiting for—" He took a deep breath. Waiting for the right person to give it to. Penelope's heart hammered against her ribs. "Preston, I know it's fast," he interrupted. "We've known each other barely a month, but I've lived enough to recognize something real when I find it." His eyes met hers, vulnerable and hopeful. "I'm not asking you to wear it yet, just to consider it. Consider me." Penelope took the ring, its weight solid and significant in her palm. "I don't need to consider," she said softly. "I already know what I want." She extended her left hand, and Preston, understanding her meaning, slid the ring onto her finger. It fit as if it had been made for her. "I love you, Penelope Hartford," Preston said, his voice steady and sure. "I think I've loved you since you stood on my doorstep, offering your most precious possession for a night's shelter." "And I love you," Penelope replied, joy bubbling up inside her like a spring. "The man who wouldn't take my locket but gave me something far more valuable, a future, a home, a heart to match my own." Preston pulled her close, sealing their promise with a kiss that spoke of devotion, of a shared life, of love that had bloomed against all odds in the harsh beauty of the Arizona territory. When Jane found them at dawn, still talking softly in the sitting room, their hands entwined and the ring gleaming on Penelope's finger, she merely smiled and put on the coffee pot. Some things, she knew, were simply meant to be. 6 months later, on a perfect autumn day, Penelope Hartford became Penelope Miles in a simple ceremony at the Silver Creek Church. Jane had closed the millinery for the day, and it seemed the entire town had turned out to witness the union of the milliner's niece and the new owner of the livery stable. Preston, resplendent in a new suit that Jane had insisted upon, waited at the altar with an expression of wonder as Penelope walked down the aisle in a gown she had designed herself. Ivory silk with pearl buttons that matched her ring. Around her neck hung the locket, returned to her by Preston the night before with a new addition, a tiny photograph of the two of them, cut to fit inside the golden heart. Their vows were simple but heartfelt, promises to cherish and protect, to support and encourage, to love through all the seasons of life that stretched before them. When Preston slipped a gold band onto Penelope's finger to join her mother's ring, his hands were steady, but his eyes were bright with emotion. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the pastor declared. and the church erupted in cheers as Preston drew Penelope into a kiss that promised a lifetime of tomorrows. The celebration that followed at the town hall was joyous music and dancing, food and laughter, the community embracing the couple who had found each other against all odds. Did you ever imagine this would be your life? Jane asked Penelope during a quiet moment, watching as Preston chatted with Collins, the former livery owner, across the room. Penelope touched her locket, thinking of that desperate night at Preston's door, of all that had happened since. Never, she admitted. But now I can't imagine any other life. Jane squeezed her hand. Your mother would be proud, your father too, despite his stubbornness. I hope so, Penelope said softly. Preston joined them then, his hand finding Penelope's as naturally as breathing. Ready to go, Mrs. Miles, our cabin awaits. Their home was not Preston's original homestead, which he had sold after purchasing the livery. Instead, they had built a new cabin on the edge of town, close enough for convenience but with enough land around it to feel private. It was larger than Preston's old place, with 2 proper bedrooms, a kitchen with a real stove and wide windows that let in the Arizona light. Our home, Penelope murmured as Preston carried her across the threshold that night, honoring the old tradition. Our beginning, Preston corrected, setting her gently on her feet but keeping his arms around her waist. Everything before was just preparing us for this. As the years passed, Silver Creek grew and prospered, and so did the Miles family. Preston's livery stable became the finest in the territory, known for its fair prices and the quality of its stock. Penelope continued to work with Jane at the millinery, eventually taking over when her aunt decided to retire to a small cottage behind the shop. Their first child, a daughter they named Eleanor Jane, arrived on their first anniversary, a tiny, perfect being with Preston's blue eyes and Penelope's auburn hair. 2 years later, they welcomed James Edward, a sturdy boy with his father's quiet demeanor and his mother's determined spirit. Through it all, Penelope kept the locket close to her heart, a reminder of how their story had begun with an act of desperation that had led to the greatest blessing of her life. Sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the sunset paint the Arizona sky in gold and crimson, she would open it and show the children the photographs inside, now 3, with the addition of a family portrait taken on James's first birthday. Tell us the story again, Mama, Eleanor would beg, curled against Penelope's side. Which story, darling? Penelope would ask, though she knew the answer. The one about the locket and the cabin and how you and Papa fell in love. And Penelope would begin, her voice soft with memory. It was a stormy night, and I had nothing left but this locket and a desperate hope. Preston would listen, his arm around his wife, sometimes adding details she'd forgotten or embellishing parts to make the children laugh. But the heart of the story remained the same, a tale of kindness given freely, of a locket offered but returned, of 2 people who found in each other exactly what they needed just when they needed it most. On their 10th anniversary, as they stood together under the stars outside their cabin, larger now, to accommodate their growing family, Preston took Penelope's hand and pressed something into it. Looking down, she found a small carved wooden heart, polished smooth and hung on a leather cord. What's this? She asked, turning it over in her palm. Open it, Preston replied, his eyes crinkling at the corners in the way she loved. The wooden heart was hinged, and inside Penelope found a tiny painting, their cabin as it had been when they first built it, with the 2 of them standing on the porch, hand in hand. I had that painter who came through town last month do it, Preston explained. Figured we should have a locket of our own, not just your mother's. Tears sprang to Penelope's eyes. It's beautiful, she whispered, throwing her arms around his neck. Not bad for a man who once couldn't offer more than a night's shelter, Preston murmured against her hair. Penelope leaned back to look into his eyes, the same eyes that had assessed her so carefully on that rain-soaked night so many years ago. You offered more than shelter, Preston Miles. You offered kindness when I needed it most, and in doing so, you gave me everything." As they stood there under the vast Arizona sky, their children sleeping safely inside the home they had built together, Penelope knew with absolute certainty that some trades were never meant to be made, and that sometimes the greatest treasures came not from what we managed to keep, but from what we were willing to give away.